the Federation of Super-Earth, keeping managed democracy safe with the lives of our heroes, protecting freedom from tyranny with the gentle touch of an iron fist. We must take back control of freedom.
The tide of war is turning against us. As we battle against the bugs for democracy, the automaton threat grows more menacing by the day. We need valiant soldiers to infiltrate their planets, take on these deadly robotic horde, and spread our message of peace and democracy.
As you all know, Helldivers 2 has absolutely taken over the internet over the past few months. Ever since its release on February 8th, 2024, its player count has been in the hundreds of thousands, and the development studio behind the title has undoubtedly made millions off of the game's success. The game being a $40 title instead of the outrageous $70 a lot of other studios are trying to charge for their new titles, proves that anti-consumer practices do more harm than good for the ecosystem. However, the game's success wasn't only down to its reasonable price tag. No matter how good the monetization is, you have to actually have a good game behind it for it to be successful. And I would argue that Helldivers 2 is one of, if not the best co-op shooter of all time. And in this video, I'll be going through and explaining all the reasons why I believe this to be the case, even despite its clear balancing flaws. So go ahead and grab some snacks as we discuss the unbalanced masterpiece that is Helldivers 2. If you have watched any content or seen any news on Helldivers 2, you'll likely understand the general premise. But the simplest way for me to explain it is that in this game, you find yourself fighting for a planet and government entity called Super-Earth, and your goal is to liberate planets in the galaxy, to spread democracy, and to push back invaders that threaten to harm Super-Earth. You do this by completing missions solo or with a team, which contributes to the overall global liberation meter of the planet you fight on. This means that over time, the entire community is contributing to the game's world in a meaningful way. And eventually, over time, with enough effort from the player base, they can entirely liberate a planet, meaning that it will no longer be a playable space. Now, these planets are split up into different areas in the galaxy map where the factions they are inhibited by are displayed. Right now, there are two factions of enemies present you can fight in the galaxy, those being automatons to the west and bugs to the east. Each of them have their own unique gameplay mechanics, which we'll get into later, but they also function as a force actively trying to push us Helldivers and the Super-Earth government back. This means that if the community decides to fight bugs over automatons, over time the automatons will start capturing more and more planets until they eventually reach Super-Earth. This makes the world feel alive and motivates the player to complete missions to contribute to the cause. Major orders that the game gives out every once in a while also helps with this by providing players with certain rewards for contributing to the overall cause of Super-Earth. These orders also provide additional lore on the universe to help the player better understand the situations underpinning each operation. It makes the player feel like they are actually engaged in an intergalactic war, and one that has grit. The propaganda scattered around the game also helps though.
But freedom doesn't come free. No! Sweet liberty! No!
Speaking of planets, this is one of the many ways the game mixes things up for the player, and is also one of the game's main strengths. Planets in Helldivers are procedurally generated, meaning that every time a new player loads into a new mission, there are different side objectives, geography, and structures scattered around that the player must take into account. Now, this would normally be a turn-off for most players due to many games with this feature feeling stale quickly. It's very hard to make procedural generation in a game work without everything feeling samey, but I think Helldivers did a really good job here. Each planet has its own properties like biomes, weather, and terrain that adds a ton of variety on top of the structures mentioned. Also, another thing that helps the game's procedural generation not feel stale is that as time goes on and Super-Earth loses control or gains control of new sectors, new planets are unlocked. These new planets a lot of the time will have new bugs or automatons, new mutations, and disasters that add tons of depth to the gameplay. For example, as I'm recording this video, the Helldivers team have just recently added a new bug called Streakers that fly and attack the player from above. These were not announced, and most people discovered them by just playing the game. There have also been clips going around on Twitter and other social media platforms of other bug types growing wings, which has led to a lot of rumors spreading around the internet. This way of adding new content without outright announcing it makes the content much more exciting, and it also helps to keep you engaged because you never know when you might encounter something new. And the game keeping you on your toes in this way is ingenious, because as long as you don't get spoiled, you can come back to the game and experience something totally new as if you were playing at launch again. Anyways, now that we have covered the basic premise and the game's community-driven features, I can now discuss the actual gameplay behind it. And trust me, the game comes out swinging in this regard. As you can likely tell from the gameplay throughout this video and from other people's videos, Helldivers has chaotic, difficult, and action-packed gameplay, unlike anything I have ever seen from any other PvE co-op shooter. The game achieves this in a couple of main ways, the biggest of which is its satisfying gunplay. Helldivers 2 has some of the best mechanical feedback I've seen from a PvE shooter. Shotguns blow entire limbs off of bugs, explosions can send robots flying back, and well-placed shots from any weapon causes blood, metal, and guts to spew everywhere. This, coupled with the amazing sound design, results in every shot you hit feeling satisfying, and it's one of the things that sets this game apart. But watching yourself blow a bug's head off with your shotgun just for its body to keep walking towards you for a few seconds afterwards is extremely satisfying and gross. This, combined with the well thought out and polished animations, the simplistic yet satisfying movement, and the necessity to balance your resources, makes this game an absolute blast, but a challenging one at that. You have to be wary of using too many grenades or running out of ammunition, because you can only get a resupply so often, meaning that you have to make decisions on when to engage or when to avoid enemy patrols. Speaking of managing resources, the game's stratagem system is another one of its amazing strengths that separates it from the crowd, and they are also an important resource that the player must keep track of. If you don't know what stratagems are, they're an extremely strong utility or explosive that can be deployed manually by the player throughout your mission. The player deploys these stratagems by hitting a quick combo and throwing them onto the ground, and these things can have some real power. The stratagems currently in the game are broken up into a couple of main categories, those being defensive, which are the sentry stratagems, supply, which are the backpacks, weapon call-ins, and vehicles, and offensive, which are all of your explosives that help you clear out groups of enemies or destroy structures. Each of these categories are important and serve their own purpose during different missions or situations. Offensive stratagems are by far the most useful of the three categories because they can help you deal with bigger or heavily armored enemies a lot easier. They can help you eliminate large groups of enemies, and they can destroy objectives for you. They also tend to be on the shortest cooldown, allowing for use more often throughout a mission. My favorite type of offensive stratagems are the Eagles. These are the stratagems that are carried out by a fighter jet. The advantages of this is that you get a faster call-in time and cooldown due to the jet staying in the area at all times. However, the downside is that all of your Eagle stratagems have to go on cooldown at once while the jet reloads and refuels. This means that if you only bring Eagle stratagems, you'll be left on your own while your jet goes back to reload. Now, the advantage of the other offensive class of stratagems, Orbitals, is that they don't have to go on cooldown at the same time, meaning that you don't have to worry about having no stratagems for a decent amount of your mission. However, generally, Orbital stratagems are not nearly as strong in comparison to Eagle stratagems, especially the early game ones. There are some really cool and strong Orbitals like the Orbital Laser, which sends a massive laser down that kills any large enemies nearby, but those are few and far between. Also, when you compare this to something like the Eagle 500 kilogram bomb that's literally just a nuke on demand, you can probably tell that the Eagles are a little bit more overtuned than the Orbitals. Just from describing them, I'm sure you can see that the offensive stratagems are extremely strong, and they are arguably the most fun due to their sheer destructiveness. However, the other categories are still worth discussing, and they are enjoyable in their own right. The defensive stratagems, as I stated earlier, are the turret stratagems, all the mine stratagems, and the shield relay. These, as you can likely tell by the name, are best designed for playing a defensive manner. So when you are on an objective or trying to extract, this is where these stratagems will shine. However, the reason why these stratagems aren't super good in comparison to other options is because the situations where you are stationary for long periods of time in Helldivers 2 are few and far between. And most of the defensive missions where these stratagems are the best just so happen to be the most boring missions in the game. Plus, even when you are stationary, a lot of the time defensive stratagems can do more harm than good for your team. There have been many times where me and my friends have sent down a mortar turret just for it to decide to kill us all for no reason. The reason for this flaw is that turrets will target enemies whether you are standing in front of its trajectory or not, meaning that the turret will just shoot you in the back just to kill an enemy in front of you. Now, I know this sounds like I'm being negative towards the defensive stratagems, but I'm really not. They are extremely fun, and making an entire build around them can be a funny niche, but it is still worth pointing out this huge balancing problem. One of my main complaints with Helldivers is that the balancing of the game is all out of whack, which I'm sure you can tell here just by me discussing the first two categories of stratagems. But when you look at the utility stratagems on top of this, the problem gets even worse, because there are some utility stratagems like the shield generator backpack that are just absolutely busted, and then there are others like the ammo backpack that are basically useless and not worth bringing. The huge gap in balance between different stratagems results in the game kind of forcing you down a path of running certain builds. Now, this isn't that bad of an issue in a game like Helldivers, since it is a co-op shooter and you can choose whatever difficulty to play on and how you want to play. But when entire swaths of the game's population are refusing to play with people that aren't using meta builds, I think this becomes more of an issue that should be addressed at some point. When I said Helldivers 2 was a masterpiece, I didn't mean it was perfect, and this is one of my only complaints that I can levy towards the game. Speaking of bad balancing, the final category of stratagems that currently exist in Helldivers, supply stratagems, are a perfect example of my complaints about balancing. There are only 2 good backpack stratagems, the rest are bad, and the support weapons vary widely in their strength. There are extremely strong ones like the autocannon and railgun that can trivialize fighting larger, heavily armored enemies, and then there are kind of mediocre weapons that are only really useful early on in your levels, like the flamethrower or any of the machine guns. Now, obviously, you'd expect as you progress in level, your stratagems to get stronger and stronger, but these balancing flaws isn't a result of a natural level progression that you'd expect. Some of even the higher level unlocks in this category, including the spear launcher and the laser cannon, are extremely weak in comparison to the other options I mentioned, like the railgun and autocannon. This doesn't only apply to utility stratagems either. Both the orbital walking barrage and the orbital 380, which just so happen to be later game unlocks, are extremely mediocre for their desired purpose of destroying structures, to the point where other stratagems like the orbital laser or 500 kilogram bomb, stratagems that are not specifically designed for that purpose, do their job better. Now, one thing I want to make very clear about this critique is that this doesn't make these stratagems boring or unfun. Every stratagem, with an exception of a small few that I can think of off the top of my head, I think are genuinely a blast to use. But having certain stratagems be the objective best makes the player feel bad for picking anything outside of this selection, because as they climb the difficulty ratings, they'll get punished more and more for trying to pick builds outside of this box. Certain stratagems being way better than all the others doesn't only have an effect on what players choose, it also has an effect on the entire progression in the game as a whole. It causes players to speed run towards certain ship upgrades with their samples while avoiding others, and once a player has dedicated countless samples into certain upgrades, they are likely not going to swap to other less strong stratagems that aren't upgraded. This was especially bad at launch before the devs decided to reduce the amount of large armored enemies that spawned, because it felt like these meta builds were absolutely necessary at any difficulty level above 7 before that changed. So I'm happy the developers are responding to the biggest critique of the game and making solid balancing changes accordingly. And speaking of enemies, I now want to go more in depth on the different enemy types you'll encounter in Helldivers, since they are arguably the biggest contributor to the gameplay overall. And trust me when I say, Arrowhead knocked it out of the park with this. As I discussed when explaining the game's premise, there are 2 main factions of enemies you will encounter during your playtime of this game. The first faction, and the one that most players put the most time into, is bugs, and the other faction is automatons or robots. There are currently 10 bug types in the game and 8 automaton types that I can confirm. Now, each of these enemies in both factions fall into 3 categories: low-level cannon fodder, slightly armored, and heavily armored. The heavily armored enemies are the ones you'll be having nightmares about. These are your Bile Titans, Chargers, tanks, and Hulks. Especially after the nerf to the railgun, these guys can be a challenge to eliminate if you aren't prepared. And late game, when you're running low on resources, you are basically screwed if they start spawning in. However, these enemies are typically my favorite to fight. They require a certain level of team coordination, and they typically only have a few weak points where good damage can be dealt. Now, when I say this, that doesn't mean you can clear these guys easily with your primary weapon. You're going to have to use some form of support weapon with a decent armor pin to dispatch these guys even through their weak points. I love these interactions because it requires your team to communicate and draw the attention of these heavily armored guys to be able to hit their weak point, which is fun. Or if all else fails, you can just nuke them. Now, the medium enemies are where I think the automatons start to beat out the bugs from a game design perspective. Bugs have commanders and bile spewers, and then automatons have striders, devastators, berserkers, and gunships. As you'll notice through gameplay, these bugs have one thing in common. Their main counter is mag dumping into their unarmored body parts. This results in bugs feeling somewhat samey and monotonous on the lower levels, where higher armored enemies are not available. However, despite the robots having less enemy types on paper, they end up feeling like they have more content due to how different each one is. For example, the Strider is completely immune to taking damage head on, but their turn radius is slow and they die really quickly from behind. Then Devastators are vulnerable to headshots and they deal damage from range, while the Berserkers have the same properties except they can only deal damage to you up close with their chainsaws. Then when you take into account the gunships that attack you from above and that require a decent amount of explosive damage, you can see already that the robots have a really well-rounded sandbox. This is vastly different to the bugs, where a lot of thought isn't really required when actually fighting them. The same can be said about both sides' cannon fodder enemies, but that's to be expected considering their purpose. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, why do people play bugs more often if they offer less gameplay variety? Well, the main reason is because, due to their simplicity, they are much easier to fight against for grinding levels and samples. This is also made easier by the base design of each faction. Bugs have nests that spawn around the map. These nests are filled to the brim with holes that allow bugs to spawn from within the planet. However, the only real danger here is the amount of enemies and the small spore mines that are scattered around the nest. Compare this to automatons, and this is a totally different ballgame. Automatons have outposts as their bases scattered around each mission. These bases can vary significantly in size and in what's within. But the general rule is that you must destroy all of these smaller buildings placed throughout the outpost to successfully destroy them, since these smaller buildings are where all of the enemies spawn from. However, the biggest reason outposts are more difficult than nests is due to the defenses that stop you from getting close. Bigger outposts have artillery and manned turrets laced on all sides. And if the artillery notice you before you can shoot them in the back, you are pretty much guaranteed to either have to give up and come back later, or sacrifice multiple lives to make a final push. This is due to the large range these artillery guns have. They can see you from a ridiculous distance, and they shoot explosives, so there's splash damage involved as well. This has offered plenty of funny moments for me and my friends while playing, but it's also led to some frustration. Just look at a large outpost and look at a large next to each other. I think you can see the massive disparity there. The difficulty disparity can also be seen in the side objectives across both factions. A lot of the side objectives are available to both sides. However, the ones that are exclusive paint this picture. Most of the side objectives found on the automaton missions provide serious consequences to the player for not completing them. Some examples of this include the stratagem jammer that stops all Helldivers in the vicinity of the side objective to lose all access to stratagems, the detector tower that will constantly spot Helldivers in the area, causing tons of dropships to spawn, the gunship fabricator that spawns gunships periodically that attack the player, and the mortar emplacement, which constantly targets players in the area with artillery and strikes them. These obviously have some serious consequences, and they can be devastating for the player if they are positioned near the extraction point or near main objectives. Also, the same thing that makes other robot outposts and bases difficult applied to the side objectives too. These side objectives are heavily guarded, and they typically have swaths of difficult to cope with robots to protect them. Trust me when I say there have been many of my runs lost due to these side objectives being positioned in the perfect spot to catch us off guard, and at the very least, they have cost me many respawns. When you compare this to bug exclusive side objectives like Spore Spewers, Stalker Lairs, and Shrieker Nests, the difference is night and day. Stalkers are definitely a nuisance, and they provide an interesting gameplay mechanic. However, their lairs don't take much to be dealt with. All you really need is a well-placed grenade, and it's pretty much down. Then the Shriekers are likely the most difficult and problematic of these due to the fact that they swarm the skies and can deal a ton of chip damage to you while you're distracted by bugs on the ground. But once again, it's nothing compared to the negative effects you face in automaton missions. Then the Spore Spewers are an absolute joke, and you can just shoot them with any sort of explosive weapon from across the map, and they're dealt with immediately. Now, it is worth pointing out that just because there is a difficulty disparity between the two sides' missions doesn't mean they aren't fun. I think the difficulty and the negative effects of the automaton side missions help the world to be more believable. You actually feel like you are fighting on a robot-controlled planet, and taking objectives down can be a lot of fun. Also, when you look at the side objectives that aren't faction exclusive, they can actually provide your team with some major benefits, and I think they are some of the best examples of Arrowhead's amazing game design. The radar station and the Siege artillery are the only examples in the game currently of what I mean. The radar station side objective, once taken over by the player, will reveal every point of interest on the map to the player, which can save valuable time. Then the Siege artillery gives the player 5 additional artillery stratagems to use across the rest of their journey. I really like this concept, and I hope we can see more added to the game because it rewards the player in a meaningful way for completing the objective inside of the mission rather than just paying out credits. Anyways, the objectives were never meant to be the focus of the gameplay in Helldivers in the first place. If the game's main focus was the objectives, then people wouldn't be raving over it. The real reason that Helldivers is praised is due to the amazing gameplay and polished mechanics we have discussed, combined with its user-friendly monetization and the memes surrounding its premise. It's very difficult to make objectives that are enjoyable to do on their own, and I think the objectives present in Helldivers are solid for their intended job. Also, I want to make one thing clear. I don't think the difficulty disparity is a huge issue. If it wasn't for the robots difficulty, a lot of the memes and videos spreading awareness about the game wouldn't exist. Also, the automatons are pretty fun, and I actually prefer fighting them over bugs just because of the simple variety and fun factor factor they provide. Obviously, grinding bugs is the smarter move if you want to progress through the game quickly, which is likely why I have double the gameplay time with bugs as I do with robots, but I don't want this critique to be levied as a huge negative. Do I think that both sides should be on an even playing field? Yes, but is it an experience ruining flaw? Absolutely not. It also allows players to have choice of progression or difficulty, which I think is an interesting trade-off nonetheless. Anyways, now that you understand the core gameplay mechanics and my main gripes with the game, we can now discuss the reason to complete all of this, and that's progression. There are three main progression systems at play inside of Helldivers. There's the Warbond system, which is the battle pass system we discussed earlier. There's the sample system, which is how you upgrade your ship. And then there is the level system, which allows you to unlock new stratagems. I like to go through each one in depth to discuss their contributions and how they shape the players want to keep playing, because trust me, as content keeps getting added, players will want to keep coming back to this game. Now, the first and most important system to keep the game going is the Warbond system. As I mentioned earlier, this is the main way the game goes about adding new content, like weapons, grenades, armor, boosters, and pretty much everything else. This contributes greatly to the game in two main ways. Firstly, it requires the player to loot side areas around the map to get enough premium credits to buy these war bonds. And secondly, it requires the player to complete main missions to acquire stars to purchase items in said war bonds. Now, I've made it clear I don't have an innate problem with this system, especially since players can make their way through it completely free. However, there is one main complaint I have. That complaint is the fact that the imbalance of the game continues into these war bonds. Some primary weapons just completely outclass others. The Breaker Shotgun, the Dominator, and the Scorcher, at least from what I've heard, are great examples of this. They just completely remove any reason to run anything outside of them because you'll be at a tactical disadvantage. The same issues apply to armor, since certain armor attributes just completely dominate in comparison to others. Now, this does have the benefit of encouraging players to progress through the systems. A lot of these dominant weapons require some level of grinding to acquire, which means that as you get higher and higher in the leveling system, you'll feel yourself getting clearly stronger. That is something Arrowhead definitely nailed with every progression system they designed. Every level and purchase makes a clear difference to your effectiveness. And the difference between you on your first level 1 mission and your 100th game is night and day. Now, speaking of other progression systems, the leveling system is another vital system in Helldivers that keeps players engaged for their first 50 hours or so. When you start out in Helldivers, you have access to a limited number of stratagems, and those stratagems really aren't that good. They get the job done in the lower level missions you are in. However, as you progress yourself through the levels via completing missions, you start getting more and more powerful stratagems. One strong enough to obliterate entire automaton bases, eradicating bile titans, and imploding swaths of enemies in one swoop. Now, you don't get these stratagems for free. You have to spend currency that you get from completing objectives and from looting side areas to purchase these stratagems that you unlock as you get higher in level. This, combined with the grind of the war bonds, makes the early game an absolute blast because you constantly feel like you are unlocking new stuff and your kit improves drastically with every few hours of gameplay. These two progression systems single-handedly carried my motivation to keep playing. I've always been someone who enjoys a good progression system, and trying to unlock everything is something I enjoy doing in every game I play pretty much, Helldivers included. And if it wasn't for these two amazingly designed progression systems that doesn't attempt to siphon money from fans, I wouldn't have been able to get the same level of enjoyment I did out of this game. However, the last progression system currently in place in the game that I have yet to discuss is not nearly as impressive or enjoyable to grind, and that is the sample system. Firstly, samples are mainly found in side areas and around nests or outposts placed throughout each planet. This encourages exploration, which I'm fine with, but once you collect these samples, they are dropped upon death, meaning that you suffer greatly for making mistakes via the system. When you die, you'll either have to go back to where you died to pick up your samples, which sometimes can be impossible depending on the situation, or you have to give up and leave your samples behind, meaning that you get nothing out of the mission ship upgrade wise. The good news is that at least samples are shared amongst the team, so if one player picks up a sample, everyone is rewarded at the end of the match for it. Now, I wouldn't necessarily mind this system, and I really don't at the surface, if the rewards you got for grinding samples was proportionate. But in my experience, ship upgrades haven't felt influential at all. If you didn't know, the ship upgrades you use your samples on are exclusively passive stat buffs to different categories of stratagems. Certain stratagems benefit more directly than others from these buffs, and some are barely affected at all. For example, Eagle stratagem upgrades are by far the best and most important upgrades to go for, because Eagle stratagems are already strong on their own, but the upgrades available for them are vastly superior to others. Even still though, these upgrades are just insignificant stat upgrades that won't make a huge difference on their own in your gameplay. This combined with the fact that most of these upgrades require a large quantity of samples, which are not fun to grind for whatsoever, makes me not enjoy the system at all. This is especially a problem when samples tend to be the only thing holding up the later game progression system due to their higher difficulty to acquire, which makes grinding later on once you already have a lot of the good boost, weapons, and stratagems not really worth it for a 10% passive cooldown boost. If there was more variety in the upgrades and they weren't so expensive, I wouldn't have much of a complaint, but with the samples being both the most difficult and least interesting system, I felt it was worth discussing since it's been one of my gripes since launch. But overall, I think the progression system in this game is amazing and really allows you to feel rewarded for putting in the time and effort to grind and sink in hours, especially as more and more content starts rolling out. Speaking of content updates, at the time of recording, multiple content updates have already been released by Arrowhead just 2 months after the game is launched. So far, we have gotten a large variety of balancing changes to different missions, weapons, and stratagems. We have gotten 2 new war bonds. We've gotten the streakers added to the game, the gunship added to the game, and the new mech stratagem added to the game. Now, post-launch war bonds have been a somewhat controversial addition to the game. This is because war bonds cost $10 or 1,000 super credits, and they contain new weapons, grenades, armor, boosts, and other important gameplay features. This in theory does allow people to pay for early access to some weapons, which has caused some people to make the pay to win argument, but this never bothered me because you can very easily unlock these war bonds via gameplay, and this game's monetization is very mild in comparison to what AAA studios are trying to get away with today. You also have to keep in mind that there are other progression systems in the game that are not tied to war bonds at all, which is a stark contrast to other games that have battle passes. Also, players can buy tiers to war bonds and fast track their way through them like in other games, which means that players only are going to really be saving themselves a couple of hours of super credit grinding by purchasing the battle passes outright. But taking the monetization argument out of this, just from what we have seen over the past 2 months, this is a lot of content for a studio the size of Arrowhead, and I've been thoroughly impressed with their post-launch content so far. The mechs announcement alone got me extremely hyped to jump back in, and I did for a brief time, and I enjoyed myself. The streakers were an amazing addition to the enemy sandbox as well, and they added some real variety to engagements. I've also had a lot of fun progression through the war bonds. I felt the rewards have been satisfactory enough to be worth grinding for, but not game-breaking to dominate the meta as some of the other weapons that came with the game on launch. My favorite part about the way the company handles post-launch content, though, is the fact that a lot of content is never announced. They just add it into the game via a new planet, and players stumble across the content in their own games. As I mentioned earlier, this adds an interesting dynamic that I've never really seen before in other titles like this, and I'm definitely along for the ride. Also, speaking of Arrowhead, the company has been making amazing statements left and right about monetization and player trust, so I believe wholeheartedly that this game is in the right hands. I think Arrowhead can continue to keep this game hype going, and hopefully we'll continue to see amazing new content from them going forward. I've been seeing people post about the game's player count going on a decline, as if celebrating the game's demise, and it saddens me. From what we have seen thus far, this is the first time in a very long time where we have had a new game release that was polished, well priced, and that didn't try to throw microtransactions or other modern gaming nonsense down our throats. So it's disappointing to see people praying for this game's downfall. However, the situation with PlayStation doesn't fill myself or others with much confidence. On May 2nd, 2024, Arrowhead announced the move to force all players going forward to log in and link their Steam account to a PSN account. This wasn't a choice, at least from what I can tell, that was made by Arrowhead. It was entirely made by Sony as an attempt to get more signups to PlayStation. This announcement angered swaths of the game's PC player base, resulting in mass negative reviews being levied to the game's Steam page. The backlash has been immense on nearly every social media platform, and it seems that all the goodwill Helldivers had managed to build over the past few months has started to come crashing down. Now, most people would hear this and think to themselves, this doesn't seem like that big of a change. Why would people be mad over having to create a simple account? Well, the situation goes a little deeper than that, and there are 3 main reasons that players are mad with this situation. The first of which is the fact that this seemingly came out of nowhere. People have been playing this game for months, including myself, without having any idea this was going to be a requirement. Arrowhead's CEO even admits that the studio had known for the last 6 months that account linking was going to be necessary, and they didn't make it easily known to the public outside of a small banner on the game's Steam page. The second reason players are mad is because the game was being sold in countries where PSN is not available. PSN is only available in 73 countries, so players who had purchased the game in the other 122 countries were going to be left with a brick in their Steam library when this change went through. Although, lucky for players in those countries, it does appear that Steam was accepting refunds of Helldivers 2 due to severe backlash the game had been receiving. So after all of that, I'm sure you can start to see why players were getting mad at this. But But there is a third reason, and that is the unsecure nature of PSN's infrastructure. PlayStation Network over the past 10 years has been hacked 5 times, each of which has resulted in personal data of users and employees finding its way on the dark web, being sold to the highest bidder. This includes payment information, email addresses, passwords, you name it. This is the main reason why many users who had the ability to create a PSN account were so mad, because if you were at all security oriented, you likely would have wanted to steer clear of this disaster of a platform. This announcement obviously was a huge deal, so much so that Helldivers dropped all the way down to below a 50% positive review ratio. This is really sad because the developers in this situation worked their ass off and they did everything right. The studio had a solid monetization plan, they made sure the game had plenty of launch content, they didn't release the game in a buggy state like other studios, and they immediately began releasing post-launch content. Sony was going to destroy all of that with this one announcement. Luckily for us all though, Sony did eventually decide after multiple days of backlash to revert this decision. We'll have to see if it's possible for the game to start getting good reviews and reception again, and I hope it does because the game deserves it, whether Sony is greedy or not. In conclusion, Helldivers 2 has some of the best core gameplay out of a co-op shooter I've played in years. The gunplay is responsive, using stratagems feels extremely satisfying, and the enemy types are well designed and super fun to fight. This combined with an amazing progression system to boot that makes you feel empowered as you climb the ladder makes this game feel extremely fun to grind, especially with friends. Also, the potential for funny moments in this game is arguably unmatched due to the absurdity of some of the possibilities this game can throw at you, and due to the choice by the devs to keep team killing in the game. It may have sounded like throughout this essay that I was being pretty negative on the game, and that's just because the game does have some flaws that are worth pointing out. And I wanted to cover those in depth so that way you guys would understand what you were getting into when you purchased the game. However, I don't want people to think that due to these critiques, I believe the game is bad. I believe quite the contrary, in fact. This is one of my favorite games released in the past 2 years, and I look forward to continuing to come back as time goes on, because the post-launch content the game has been adding has been absolutely amazing. And as long as Sony keeps their greedy hands off of Arrowhead and lets them continue to develop the game, I see Helldivers having an amazing future ahead. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video covering Helldivers 2. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to see me make more videos like it, I would appreciate it if you would consider subscribing and following me on Twitter so you don't miss the next upload. I post game reviews, video essays, and retrospectives on this channel regularly that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Now, if you want to watch another video just like this one, I'll be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.